Can everybody hear me? Great. Welcome everyone, Boston University students, faculty, leadership, Humphrey Fellows, and participants who are participating via live stream. We're simulcasting this across the world. Welcome to the new Rajan Kilachan Center here at Boston University. It's a brand new building, thanks to Rajan Kilachan. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm a professor of global development policy at the Pardee School for Global Studies, and I'm also the director of the Global Development Policy Center here at BU. It's one of the newest research centers here at Boston University. We like to call ourselves the GDP Center. This is just our third year, and the GDP Center is administered by the Pardee School of Global Studies and BU Research. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. I want to thank you all for coming here to welcome back Jin Liqun, president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I said welcome back because President Jin is a graduate of Boston University's Hubert Humphrey Fellows Program. And this is his first time back to Boston University since he graduated just a few short years ago. Established in 1978, the Humphrey Fellowship Program sponsors experienced professionals from designated countries undergoing development or political transitions to spend a year in the United States and hosted by a university of excellence that is paired with the students' expertise. Last year, BU celebrated its 40th year as a sponsor of the Humphrey Fellows Program, and we're the only university in the country that has maintained a relationship with the Humphrey Fellows Program since its very beginning in 1978. Our own BU program here has 500 alumni members from 120 countries. The current cohort of Humphrey Fellows at BU includes 11 fellows from such places as Ecuador, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Moldova, and beyond. The program is part of a long legacy of development studies here at Boston University that goes all the way back until 1953, when we started the African Studies Center, which is now housed at the Pardee School for Global Studies. We have a long tradition in the Department of Economics, which is currently embodied in the Institute for Economic Development, and clusters of excellence in the School of Public Health, Questrom, and the Department of Earth and Environment. And the new Pardee School of Global Studies, we put advancing human progress at the core of our fundamental mission at the Pardee School. The GDP Center seeks to knit together all these different clusters of excellence across Boston University. And because of our work on development banks, we're particularly interested and honored to have today's speaker, President Jin of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Born in China, at an early age, Mr. Jin inherited a keen interest in English language and in literature. Indeed, his initial career ambition was to be a professor of English literature, as he was enthralled with the works of Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, and Massachusetts' own Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nevertheless, development concerns were also a key component of his early upbringing. His village was only connected to the electric power grid in the 1970s. It was considered a wild fantasy for him and his family to have a two-storied farmhouse with electricity and running water, a flushing toilet, a telephone, and storage for sufficient grains back in those days. In 1978, he enrolled in the Beijing Institute for Foreign Languages, now the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and his papers on William Faulkner's fiction were published in one of China's most prestigious journals and got him a job as a professor at his alma mater right after he graduated. Just as he was getting into his academic life as an English professor, China joined the World Bank in 1980, and his supervisor at the school told him, as he quoted in an article with Bloomberg, his supervisor said, "I'm sure that about 200 professors of English literature would suffice for China, but there's an imminent need and an acute shortage of professionals in the economics and financial field, particularly those who are home with English." So Jin Liqun moved from being a professor of English literature to the Ministry of Finance in China. So maybe Robert Pinsky, who many of you know, the former poet laureate of the United States, who's a professor here at BU, maybe he'll be in the Treasury someday. Well, Jin Liqun moves from being a literature professor to the Ministry of Finance, and that's where BU comes in. The Chinese government encouraged him to apply where? To the Humphrey Fellows Program here at Boston University to work on economics, finance, and development. He studied finance and development, and then he immediately went down to Washington to serve as the alternative executive director or the ambassador for his country to the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility. After serving at the World Bank, he spent nearly 2 decades at the Chinese Ministry of Finance, reaching the rank of vice minister. From 2003 to 2008, he served as a vice president for operations at the Asian Development Bank. Then from 2008 to 2014, he was the chairman of the board at the China Investment Corporation, China Sovereign Wealth Fund, and the China International Capital Corporation. In a study that we did at the GDP Center last year, we estimate that there is an annual financing gap of about 5.5% of GDP for sustainable infrastructure across the world economy over the next 20 years. Despite the widespread recognition of these glaring gaps, much of the Western multilateral development banks had abandoned infrastructure financing and were only providing roughly about 3% of that need on an annual basis. In the wake of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, many emerging market and developing countries heightened their demands for infrastructure financing and said they'd also even be willing to pay for it. Since the harmful crises that hurt those regions in the 1980s and the 1990s, many developing countries had accumulated a lot of dollar-based reserves to insure themselves from financial instability and to try to prevent programs from the International Monetary Fund, which had created a big stigma across a lot of the world. These nations offered to provide some of that capital to the World Bank in 2008 and 2009 and its counterparts in exchange for a commitment to more financing for infrastructure and to a commitment to have more say on how decisions were made in these institutions. These countries were largely rebuffed by the West and have instead recapitalized many of their own national and regional development banks, and 2 new major multilateral development banks have been created as well. In 2013, President Xi Jinping of China announced the government's decision to take part in the creation of 2 new multilateral development banks. Later that year, the New Development Bank, a development bank coordinated by the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, was founded, and also the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with President Jin Liqun as the first president. The United States was invited to join the AIIB, as it is called, but declined. One prominent U.S. official who has a long career at one of the universities across the river said that the AIIB will be remembered as the moment the United States lost its role as an underwriter of the global economic system. Well, rather than creating a rogue development bank, as some feared, President Jin hired an American, Natalie Lichtenstein, who came to our center last year, to craft a legal infrastructure for the AIIB that draws on the strengths and streamlines the weaknesses of the multilateral development banks in the world economy. That's not to say that the AIIB is not without controversy and growing pains that are expected for an institution that entails large infrastructure projects and is just getting off the ground as a new global institution. But the AIIB is now firmly a welcome part of the family of DFIs working to improve the lot of the world's people. President Jin comes here to Boston University to us today because he's going to be in Washington for the next couple of days as part of the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. And he comes at a time of real tension in the world economy. After a more upbeat outlook just 18 months ago, the International Monetary Fund now warns of a synchronized slowdown in the world economy and a heightened risk of financial instability, largely due to the protectionist policies of the United States and the uncertainty around that, and the subsequent trade dispute with China. This is on the heels of the United Nations General Assembly meetings just a few weeks ago, where we learned that the multilateral pledges to curb poverty and mitigate climate change are not being fulfilled. President Jin has a lot to bring to these discussions. As he said earlier, promoting sustained economic development through infrastructure investment without leaving an environmental footprint is our sacred mission at the AIIB. Such an approach will ultimately contribute to long-term growth of those developing countries which are grappling with poverty and other economic and social challenges. He promises not to just say these things, but to do them. He's been quoted as saying, "The whole world will judge us by how we perform, not by what we claim." President Jin is going to come speak for about 35 minutes or so, and I'll ask you to hold any questions that you have until after he's done, and then I'll join him at the table here, and we'll have a dialogue with all of you folks. And as you raise your hand for a question, let's get to know each other. Please tell us who you are. We'll take a couple questions at a time and let him respond. So friends, I present to you Boston University alum and president of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Jin Liqun.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, faculty members, students. It's really my great honor to be invited back to my alma mater, which I'm so proud of. But I can tell you, I feel a little bit guilty because over the last 3 decades, just 3, right? I never ever came back really on the campus. So when I think the first thing I did was last year in Washington, D.C., and I addressed the faculty members and some students at Boston University, sharing with them our views and approaches to development. So my topic focuses on the multilateral approach to development. It may not be very new and very innovative, but actually to do something meaningful with impact is not that easy. So Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or we call it AIIB or AIIB, was initiated by the Chinese leader in the APEC meeting 2013 in the Bali Island in Indonesia. And then we started to put a team to set up this bank from January 2014. It took us 2 years to negotiate the Articles Agreement and reaching agreements on a lot of basic stuff. And then the January 2016 January the 16th, the bank was up and running. So now we're almost 4 years into operation. So there's something for us to discuss and share with you. We now can say we are global citizens in the family of multilateral development banks, MDBs. We are learning from the sister institutions, but we do not think we should be a clone, we should be a copy of the existing institutions, no matter how wonderful they have been contributing to poverty reduction, to economic development over these years. So as a new member, we need to have something new. And I think the most important mission of this bank is to promote a multilateral approach to development bank in the 21st century. What have we done? We can give you the numbers. We have done, by the end of this year, more than $10 billion of investment in 18 countries. And the big pipeline is being built. So over the next 5 or 10 years' time, we can do more. But I don't think the number is that important because anybody can give you the money, can give you projects. What is important is to build a multilateral development bank with 21st century governance. And this bank is not simply building roads, railways, ports the traditional way. We should do it in a new way with attention to environment, to take care of the people, and to have all these infrastructure projects to have more impact, a deeper impact on the global economy. This is what we intend to do. But even though the idea was proposed by China, it's not possible for China to develop or set up this bank single-handedly. China has to work with all of the other members of the international community to build a really new type of a bank with the highest standards possible. A lot of people were very much suspicious of this. They were suspicious of Chinese political motivation. They were questioning China's ability to take care of this bank. I find it's a very interesting article carried by Financial Times very early. And there was somebody who's based in Beijing. He said, the Financial Times reporter seems to be, pretty objective. And he said, somebody who was based in Beijing scoffed at the very idea of China creating this development bank. Do they have talents? Can they do it? And article said, probably this time China will be able to do it. Actually, I don't bear anybody grudge who say anything of that kind. But this really alerts to the importance of working together with all of the members of the international community. We depend on the collective wisdom to do this. We depend on experience of the World Bank, EBRD, AIIB, and all those veteran development practitioners to contribute to the building of this bank. So I said on many occasions, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was born with the birthmark of China, but it is being brought up in the international family. If we have achieved something, I'm sorry we have disappointed some of these skeptics, at least I can tell you, this is the product of international cooperation. This represents the development approach or multilateral approach to development. And this reminds me of the efforts under the leadership of the United States in 1944 to set up the Bretton Woods institutions, not far away from here. I read some books about the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions. The United States called in so many countries, including China, to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to talk about the reconstruction of those war-devastated countries, to talk about setting up a new international economic order, to avoid mistakes made by those countries in Europe in the wake of the First World War. You know, 1944, the war was still raging in Europe, in Pacific. The war was not finished. But the United States leaders at that time already were designing the new system. That kind of a spirit should never get lost in this country. And I believe from the day one when we try to set up this bank, we need to work with everyone, every country. So I went to European countries, inviting them. I came to the United States. I visited the White House and the State Department, Treasury, and we invited the United States sincerely to join this bank as the founding member. It did not materialize, but it's okay. It's not a big problem, because we believe this new bank would have to work to be successful with all of those in different manners. Regardless of the membership, we have worked with the United States, with Japan. These are only two major countries which are not members. But we have members from across the world, from each and every continent except Antarctic. But in what way? I would say we have an American professionals working in this bank. All of the staff are recruited on merit base, meritocracy, on the basis of meritocracy. And we work with American financial institutions, and we would encourage American business people to compete for the contracts, because we practice international competitive bidding. So we told the whole world, we recruit professionals of high caliber from all of the countries, regardless of the membership of their country. We don't look at your passports. We look at your professional, ethical record, integrity. That's what we do. That is why we could have such a bank. We have only limited number of people, 350. And we are continuing to grow. Kevin referred to Natalie Lichtenstein, an American lawyer. She had experience in the U.S. Department of Treasury. She worked in the private sector. She had a long experience in the World Bank. And she wrote a book, published by the Oxford University Press. When I was elected as the interim secretary, as the Secretary General of the Multilateral Interim Secretariat, putting up this bank, I immediately appointed Natalie Lichtenstein as the chief counsel. So some people say, they question my decision. Say, the United States refused to join this bank, and the first important position you give is an American. Some people even asked me, don't you think we Asians have no lawyers? Don't you think we have good lawyers? I said, yes, you do. Yes, we do. But lawyers are paid handsomely, and we just give them a very meager compensation. Are they willing to come? And secondly, lawyers cover pretty vast areas. We must have somebody who is very much knowledgeable about the multilateral development banks, multilateral approach. That's the very first appointment I make. Now, if you look at the senior management team of this bank, we have 5 vice presidents. 5. 3 are Europeans. 2 are Asians. We've got a vice president from UK, Germany, France, and 2 Asian vice presidents. One is from India, the other from Indonesia. All recruited on the basis of meritocracy, certainly recommended by their governments. 3 are Europeans out of 5. But if you look at the shareholding, 75% of the shares are taken by the Asians. Only 25 shares were taken by the non-Asians. So you see, if you talk about the nationality, probably Asians say, hey, why we have only 2 VPs, even though the president, by Articles of Agreement, must be an Asian national. Okay. But also, the president must be elected by special majority, 75% of the votes and 2/3 of the members. Now, when we negotiated this structure, some people did think the threshold for the election of president is too high. Now, I'm the one who opposed that. If you have 51% of the votes supporting you as the president, how can you mobilize 49%? So 75% is important, right? And also, we decided to create a very good governance structure. As you see, the same as the Bretton Woods institutions, board of governors, board of directors, and a management team, the same. However, the voting rights allocation is different. We have, as you see, simple majority for approving the specific investment or something, and quite normal. But something important must be approved by the supermajority, 75%. We've been working on some of the important policies. They are all approved with 75% of the votes. What's the difference between this bank and the Bretton Woods institutions? In the Bretton Woods institutions, the US, as the majority shareholder, has the veto power. When I joined the World Bank in 1980, I remember the World Bank's, the United States voting power was, I think, 20 something. Now it went down all the way to 16 point something. By that time, if the United States, because special majority is 81, so one vote by the US would be defeating the whole thing. And then when the US voting power came down with the new members, Russia, Switzerland, and so many countries. So the special majority has been raised just to make sure US would maintain its veto power. Okay, that was the legacy of the 1944. Do you think China or any other country setting up a multilateral bank in today's world would do that? I don't think so. You cannot get support from that. So for us, the special majority is fixed. 2/3 of the members, 3/4 of the voting power. How about China's voting power? China has 30% of the shares with 26.06% of the voting power. So at this stage, China has the de facto veto power. But you know, we have now 100 members from 57. So after the selective capital increase to accommodate the new members from 57 to over 100, China's voting power would come down below 25%. Then China will lose the veto power. Would China say, no, let's change the special majority? No. It's cast in the Articles Agreement. It's not going to change. So when I discussed this issue with some of the officials in the United States Treasury, and it's very interesting, when we discussed this, they look at me a little bit surprised. I read her mind. She seems to be saying, are you crazy giving up the veto power? And this is my reading, maybe wrong, right? But then she said, actually, if we were setting up a new bank, the United States will not do the same. I think that's true. That speaks of the people's understanding of different ages. So my view is, if we really want to work together as a family, as an international family, living in a village on this tiny, tiny earth, you need to be sincere in cooperation. Regardless of the de facto veto power or loss of veto power, one thing is crucial. If all of the shareholders like it, why do you oppose? If most of these people don't like it, why do you insist? So, you should not keep this as a special privilege. So that's really a new kind of thinking. I think in the international forum, there are some issues pretty controversial. And this controversy may last for a long time before people really have their views converged, such as climate change. There's been debate with regard to the causes for the climate change. And now, I think after the Paris Agreement, we all agree that we need to address this, right? So you need time for people to understand what is most important. This bank has the core value, as you may have noticed. The core value, 3 words: lean, clean, green. To be lean, we want to avoid huge bureaucracy, a lot of redundancy, the so-called institutional obesity. Easier said than done. When the institution is young, it's new, it's easy. But when you grow, when you start to grow, like a human being, put a lot of fat, a lot of weight, a lot of cholesterol, and you find it's very hard, very painful. To shed all this fat is not that easy. So we have to keep in mind the bank should remain very lean. And how lean? I don't know. There might be some references. With the same amount of capital, same amount of lending program, how many people do you need? So my interpretation or my definition of being lean is no redundancy. We just have to create all the necessary positions to get our job done. No redundancy. Clean. Being clean is crucial for an international institution. We have zero tolerance for corruption. In our bank, we make it very much clear, staff should do their best to follow the rules, to observe all those policies. But we tolerate mistakes. When staff make mistakes, fine, we don't punish them. But please don't make the same mistake again, okay? Of course, you cannot tolerate dereliction of duty, or outrageous negligence. That's not the mistakes we talk about. But no tolerance for corruption, for cheating, for fraud. And I put myself under surveillance of everyone. Everyone. So the senior management team attaches great importance to making this bank squeaky clean. But of course, when China initiated this, and there were lots of suspicions because China, has a lot of corruption problems, right? So the government has been cracking down on corruption, but whether China can create a bank with a Chinese national as the president and keep the banking business clean, this is, I think, so important. It's vital, right? So we tolerate mistakes, but we don't tolerate corruption. Being clean is so important. All of the members of this bank are signatory countries of Paris Agreement. And if the United States becomes the members of this bank, I hope the US would also be signatory countries of the Paris Agreement, because it's so important for us to deal with climate change. So being green, promoting green economy is our sacred mission. It's so important for us. But how do we define being green? Of course, renewables. We finance renewables, which is green. But there are some other things. I'll give you some of the examples. We encourage the countries to build mass transit systems. We build a subway, we build roads, and particularly light rail subways, so that people would be encouraged to use the mass transit system rather than driving cars individually. Or building smart grid, improving, upgrading the power transmission and distribution system. In developed countries, the systemic loss of power transmission is less than 5%. 3 decades ago, when we worked with the World Bank to finance the first transmission project with modern technology, 500 kV DC transmission line. It's a huge project crossing the Yellow River, Yangtze River. And China started to have the modern state-of-the-art transmission system. But if you look at so many developing countries in today's world, a lot of these countries, if not all of them, have transmission system way outdated. The systemic loss could be as high as 30%. But imagine you cut the systemic loss by 15%, down to, by 50% down to 15. It amounts to building so many power plants, right? So we do that. We believe this is important. Of course, hydro, hydropower stations are important, but we've been very much careful about building hydropower stations. So far, we reinforce the dams, we upgrade the generators. We have not yet done new hydro dams. We are not doing that. We are being very much careful. Because I said, if you do something not so good to the local community, they protest, they demonstrate, okay, they will have their voice heard. But when you do something wrong with agriculture, with the fish, with these kind of things, they are silent. You don't see their demonstration. You see only their extinction. So I've been very careful with hydropower stations. So we should minimize the impact on the environment. And of course, there are some other things you can do. Indeed, improving the energy efficiency of so many buildings in major cities goes a long way, right, in being green. So we need to address a very tough issue to meet the needs of the people who are being lifted out of poverty. Because being lifted out of poverty, their immediate request is to have clean power. They want to take a shower like you every day. They want to improve their mobility. But how can we achieve this without leaving a big footprint in the environment? This is very tough. Thanks to Kevin, I was at least an English literature major, and actually I'm not that bad in American literature. I love the American literature about New England. I remember, I don't know whether you have read Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales. Most famous, Pioneers, The Last of Mohegans, right? And in the Pioneers, I found something. That was the description of the U.S., the America, North America, in the early 18th century. And New England is basically unspoiled by the humans. And that there were certain farms or something. In those days, there were so many forests of trees. And there's one very good species called sugar maple. Sugar maple is hardwood. The sap could be used for syrup and also to sugar. Sugar maple is very nice wood. And those people simply would use the sugar maple to put in the fireplace. They burn. So some people who are really environment conscious said, how could you put this as a fuel wood? You think this is inexhaustible? Even more than 200 years ago, people here take environment so much to their heart. That's why it touched me. And if you read William Faulkner, his Go Down Moses, the bear, you see how people in those days tried to come to terms with nature. The bear was simply some animal, wild animal in the wilderness, right? What does it represent? And how humans deal with that. So when I read about the American literature about New England early in the days, I often think, 200 years ago, 250 years ago, people are so conscious about the environment. How about us today? We should do more. We should do better, right? So being green is really important. Now let me come back to the governance structure. The new feature of this bank is we don't have the resident board. We follow the practice of the private sector companies. Private sector companies have the board, which is non-resident. The board meet 4 times a year, discussing the major policy issues, the business development, but the specific investments decisions are made by the management. So this is their way of doing that. But in the Bretton Woods institutions, there was the resident board. There was the debate, heated debate between Keynes and Harry Dexter White, whether there should be resident board or not. Keynes was opposed to having resident board, and you can find his arguments in volume 3 of his biography. Harry Dexter White represented the U.S. Treasury under the Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau. And the U.S. wanted to have this. I would say in those days, when the transportation was not so easy, when people went by boats rather than flying, it makes a lot of sense for people to stay here. Today, with a click of a mouse, you solve lots of problems. You could have virtual meetings. You have easy exchange access to information. So I don't think it's that important. The oversight of the management by the board does not rest with the residency. It's the system that monitors the management and the staff. But you see, the issue is not simply costs of maintaining a resident board. The issue is division of responsibility. When the board takes care of everything, policies, strategies, they approve specific investment projects, what is the responsibility of the management? Over the last 7 decades, nobody was fired because of the misjudgment, because of the failures of the projects. You know why? Because the decision was made by the board. It's not by the management. So if anything happens, as long as the president or senior management members did not commit any crimes or corruption, if they did not put the money in their own pockets, they have no problem. No matter how much public money goes down the drain, they have no responsibility. It's all approved by the board. That is why there's no clear division of responsibility, no accountability whatsoever. And of course, a resident board staying on the premises would tend to micromanage. But if the board does not micromanage, there's no reason for you to stay there, right? But nobody's been talking about that. I thought about this. I call this the vacuum of responsibility. Vacuum of responsibility, because nobody is really held accountable. So when we start to create this bank, I talked to a lot of European countries, and I also certainly talked to the American friends here. I said, actually, if we set up this bank, if we have a clear division of responsibility between the board and the management, we are really asking for trouble. Because if the board does not approve specific investments, we lose the nuclear umbrella protecting the management. If anything goes wrong, we are held accountable. We cannot go scot-free. We cannot do anything with impunity. So why should we ask for trouble? Because we want to set up a bank with a new governance strategy, with a new modus operandi. So far, I have approved one project, and I'm going to approve another project because the transition is smooth. We're not going to take all the authority from the board to approve projects. The board continues to approve specific investments, and they will delegate this responsibility to the president step by step. So this is what we do. Right? Now, how could we make assessment of this kind of new approach? I would say, in a matter of a couple of years, we will take a look at the way we spend our money. We should show the scorecard, how this bank is more cost effective, and how this bank would achieve its objective. and without going back to the shareholders asking for money again and again. That is another issue. MDBs tend to go back to the shareholders every 5 or 6 years or something to have a capital increase. Have you seen any private company, the shareholders, the real owners of that company, hire the CEO, and the CEO would appoint the senior management members and recruit all the staff? What do the shareholders expect? Do they expect you, the CEO, the management, to come back to them asking for money again and again and again? They expect you to pay them to make money out of this money, contribute. This is what they expect. But nobody questioned this. Nobody asked a single question about this. So my view is, as MDBs, we should stop milking the shareholders. We should contribute. So you see, when you look at the history of the existing MDBs, I would say they've been doing wonderful jobs. China has benefited enormously from the World Bank, from AIIB. I think their contribution is undisputed. But 70 years later or 50 years later, do you think it's time for us to have a review of the experience and try to improve the way we promote development? So if there are some problems in the existing institutions, it's not the responsibility of any special group of people. It's history, it's the legacy. But if we create a new bank and we repeat the same kind of problems, it's, in my view, really idiotic, right? So we enjoy the advantage of learning from the existing institutions with their rich experience, and we enjoy the advantage of avoiding some of the issues. And this is what we need to do. But you know, we work in a different environment. The way we finance infrastructure is very much different from what we did 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I came back to Boston. Charles River remains the same, but the water flowing in the river is not. I see the clouds flying over our heads. The same sky, the clouds are different. Things change. So we need to deal with all those developing countries to do it in a new way. We're not dealing with the same kind of people. We're not dealing with the same kind of governments. They have all changed. If we don't change, we are misfits. We should not be there, right? So I think for us, being agile, being adaptive, looking at a new development trend is what we need to do. But one thing is fixed: multilateral. Multilateral approach to development is the key. Why? Because we share the same planet, and we work for the shared benefits and interests of the people. If we do not cooperate, there's no way you can talk about development. So I would say the United States took the lead in 1944, and the world still expects the United States, the biggest economy, to continue to play a big role. On the other hand, China, India, and many developing countries are beginning to play a bigger role, and that is important in our view. So I think we have enjoyed a very good relationship with the U.S. and U.S. companies, financial institutions. As you know, Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan served as our advisors for the sovereign rating. We got AAA from all of the 3 rating companies. And New York Bank, New York Mellon, is a dollar clearing bank for our institution. And Goldman Sachs and BlackRock are the asset managers of our institution. So we have full engagement with the U.S. regardless of the membership. And this is a new spirit of cooperation, right? People shouldn't feel bad about it. We will continue to run this bank in the spirit of international cooperation. We would continue on the road of multilateral approach to development. It's not that easy, but I think it's workable. As you know, we have enjoyed a very good relationship with the World Bank Group and EBRD, AIIB. We call this co-financing. As you see, when we invest in infrastructure, normally infrastructure are huge. To give you one example, we did one project in Azerbaijan, Turkey. It's called a TANAP, gas pipeline, $8.6 billion US. Who can do it all on its own? No. So World Bank putting $800 million, 50-50 for Azerbaijan and Turkey. We give Azerbaijan $600 million. And there are mammoth infrastructure projects we will do in the future. So co-financing is important. So I assured the president of the World Bank, Jim King, he left, and I met President David Malpass. I said, we will continue to work hard together. World Bank, as the global international institution, would continue to take the lead. I said, you are the conductor, okay? You continue to conduct. For me, AIIB, a very small new bank, just to give me a seat. I play clarinet or oboe or flute. That's good enough for me. As long as I have a seat to contribute to the music, to the symphony, that's good enough. But we do have to work together. You see, if you listen to solo piano, solo violin, you think it's really beautiful. But when you listen to the concerto, listen to the symphony, you feel your heart would be beeping more vehemently because you see the power of the music. Whereas if it's solo, you only enjoy the beauty of the music. They are different. Thank you very much.
Let's go sit over here. And I'll let you sit there in the middle.
I sit here?
Yeah. Well, folks, we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers with President Jin. I would like to we'll take a cluster of a couple and then let him respond to them. But since he was a Humphrey Fellow, our first question should come from Humphrey, one of our current Humphrey Fellows. Please, hi. And please, as I said earlier, please introduce yourself to us all so we can all get to know each other a little better.
Good morning. I am Tanya Recalde from the Philippines, and I'm also doing my PA with the GDP Center. Coming from a developing country, we welcome the work of AIIB in infrastructure development. And I understand that AIIB has been born with a Chinese birthright, an Asian birthright, but it's global in outlook. But coming from a country in Southeast Asia, I'd like to know the work that AIIB is doing towards infrastructure developments in ASEAN countries, and the work of AIIB in regional integration with Southeast Asia.
Okay, I'll take a couple and then we'll... Okay, hi.
Yunan Chen, a Global China Fellow at the GDP Center. As you discussed, the AIIB is an institution with a Chinese birthmark, but has become much more global in scope and learning from the other existing MDBs. And currently, the model seems to be cooperation and co-financing with the existing multilateral development banks. I want to ask you, what do you see with the AIIB in the future in terms of working with Chinese institutions? So much of infrastructure finance globally is coming from Chinese national development banks. Is this an opportunity that you see for the AIIB to work with its own domestic Chinese institutions and perhaps to apply its norms of lean, clean, and green towards Chinese national-sponsored projects and programs like the Belt and Road Initiative?
Thank you. Take one more. I saw a hand up in the back. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm PhD student in political science department here at BU. My question, I like your several kind of ideas about, for example, tolerate mistakes, but not tolerance for corruption, right? But for me, sometimes I think corruption can be interpreted as a mistake. So as a president, right, I think in management, do you see the dilemma to distinguish mistakes or corruption from mistakes? Another dilemma I found about your last point, right, which I found it maybe also a dilemma for other multilateral development bank as well, is that actually profitable, and sometimes I think maybe doing things in the long term may make, for the environment, right, may not make the investment profitable. So do you see the dilemma between making profit and kind of doing good?
Thank you.
These will be two of my questions. Thank you.
We'll do another round.
Thank you. There's no confusion between corruption and mistakes in your work. They are completely different, because we have the rules about what can be done, what shouldn't be done. So corruption, cheating, fraud, very clear-cut issues, and there's no confusion. By mistake, for instance, we make some judgment about the commercial risks of that investment. We may be wrong. We may not be able to predict sudden change in a macroeconomic situation of a particular country. Or because of early days in setting up the IT system, there were some loopholes. And for instance, it's possible you put the wrong number, something like that. So mistakes in the work is not the same thing as corruption. It's very clear. Okay, you put your money in, put public money in your own pocket. That's corruption. Period. There's nothing you can argue for. But again, and there's something. It is I would say ethical issues. Somebody may not be committing corruption or not cheating. However, the way they behave is very much obnoxious, and it's not good for the culture. For instance, we don't tolerate sexual harassment. If it happens, out. Because it's very much clear. It's not mistake. It's not. It's very much clear. So we want to create a culture in which people respect each other. They should not abuse each other. And particularly the supervisors should not abuse the staff. And that kind of things are not to be tolerated. What do we do? I think basically we finance all of the infrastructure projects defined in a traditional manner. You see roads, railways, airports, seaports. For instance, in the Philippines, we are doing the flooding control project. We're also talking about some other kind of projects. In Indonesia, we work with the World Bank to finance the slum upgrading project, okay, to clean up the rivers, to provide a power, safe drinking water to the people, to improve the streets conditions, something of that kind. It's a slum upgrading. So you may have noticed that we finance infrastructure and other productive sectors. Now, this is very much important. You build infrastructure for what? Infrastructure facilities themselves will not give you money back. You need to develop the economy. You need to improve the processing, manufacturing capabilities of a country so that they can take advantage of these infrastructure facilities to be productive. So we call this other productive sectors. So when we put this in, some people ask me, Mr. Jin, what do you mean by other productive sectors? And I said, other productive sectors means other productive sectors, okay? So I don't want to define in a very narrow way. For instance, African countries or some other resource-rich economies, over the centuries, they export raw material, they import manufactured goods. And they describe this as a kind of colonial trade relationship. Of course, they want to break away from this kind of, trading pattern. Building roads is important. Improving the logistics is important. But if there's no manufacturing capability, all this comes to nothing. Give you one example. In Cambodia, Cambodia has land. If properly irrigated, they can produce rice. But so far, they don't even have the agri-processing capacity. The paddies were imported to Vietnam or Thailand to be processed to be rice. This little bit value added would also be gone because they are not good in the processing industry. So in my view, we need to build infrastructure. At the same time, we should try our best to help them improve their manufacturing or processing capabilities so that some of these poor countries can break away from the traditional trade pattern. And China, you see, this bank is a multilateral development bank. We operate by the international best practice. People often ask me, and people often get confused with BRI and our bank. So we need to clarify. Belt Road Initiative is a platform in which countries are encouraged to work together. They can work out some ideas, how to improve connectivity. But I think one of the biggest mistake or misconception is that Belt Road is a China program. If China puts money in it, it's Belt Road. Or other countries are doing it without Chinese involvement, it's not. I think that's wrong. If we look at the connectivity, for instance, vast Eurasia land, or North America, South America, or Central America, you see, the connectivity is not very good indeed. If China is working on with some countries here, and some other countries are working over there, without any Chinese involvement, but at the end of the day, we see the connectivity, I think that's Belt Road. Belt Road initiative does not mean only with China's involvement it makes sense. That's wrong. And our bank is an international institution which operates by its own standards. So they are not the same thing. And also, we process project proposals if they are proposed to us by the client countries. If Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, they want to work with us, they propose projects to us. And then we would process the projects. We do not pick projects from the Chinese government's list. We don't do that, okay? And it's probably would be creating a huge misunderstanding of why we pick from the Chinese government's list and then do this for a particular country. It's not the way like that. Having said that, I think there would be good opportunities for us to work with the Chinese companies such as China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, or some private companies moving forward. But we all agree if they want to work with us, there are two basic conditions. First, the project in a particular country must have the full support of that country, government or private sector, local community. Secondly, they follow our bank's standards, environment, social, and we have the three basic requirements. The project must be financially sustainable. It should not create debt problems, should improve the debt sustainability rather than exacerbate debt problems. So the project must be sustainable. And that actually brings me to the issue of the so-called profitability. The MDBs don't maximize profits. But it's wrong to assume that MDBs don't care whether you make money or not. I think that's wrong. MDBs must achieve regional profit margin to be sustainable, to avoid going back to the shareholders asking for money. So proper profitability is a must. And then second requirement is environmental friendliness. We are not going to leave a big footprint in the environment, in the ecosystem. We definitely will not exacerbate the emission problems. We need to deal with the climate change. So the third requirement is any project we support, we finance in a country must be acceptable to the local community. If the local people don't embrace those projects, if they are opposed to those projects for any reason, we will not do it. That does not mean if there's one family who doesn't like it, we don't do it. If there are a couple families or some people who don't like this idea, then we will see why. Give you some examples. And this is what I discuss with a lot of the host countries. In terms of resettlement, it's normally not the compensation amount or level of compensation, it's the transparency problem. It's lack of transparency that creates problem. It's not the level of compensation. And if you resettle some people in Bangladesh, you want to have the same standards when you resettle some people in suburban Boston. It might be, this is ridiculous. You're going to ruin the country, right? You bankrupt the country. But most often, the resettlement problem is associated with lack of transparency. So some people who are in charge of this will set aside some money, and they try to deal with those people who are nice, who are cooperative. And then with the rest of money, those people who refuse to budge, then they buy them out. And the rest they keep in their own pocket. And this is very often, right? But then you create more problems. When the people who resettled earlier said, oh, those guys refused to budge in the government, they all come back to you. So if you are transparent, if the compensation is reasonable, rational, and then if there are certain families who are not reasonable, you can bring this to the court. The money could be put in the trust account. So there are ways to deal with that. But if the local government, if the government is really dedicated to helping its people and corruption-free, I think lots of problems could have been resolved. That's why we maintain 3 basic standards: financial sustainability, environmental protection, and protection of the people. Okay?
Thanks. We'll take a couple more. Wow, everyone's ready to ask a question now. My friend, hi. Oh, please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Zhuge Liqun, exactly same Liqun. I'm PhD in economics here. So I have 2 questions for you. So this morning,
Pick one.
okay, this morning I saw a report saying that the third quarter had seen the slowest GDP growth
China,
of
right?
China. Yeah, I was wondering, do you have any suggestion to how to drive the economy through domestic consumption or overseas investment, which is essentially one of the basic goal of the AIIB? And
Okay, that's good.
Min?
Hello, Ming Ye or Ye Ming, professor at Pardee School of Global Studies here. Wonderful talk, and I'm very impressed with your last analogy of the concert. And I want to ask, now AIIB is happy to be one player in this concert. What's your ambition or expectation of the, whether the AIIB will go to the main player or even a leading player, how long the time horizon you see?
Thank you.
Thanks.
One last one. Sin Wei in the back.
Thank you so much. I'm Xin Yuema, the research and project lead of the China program at the GTV Center. Actually, the GDP research team just came back from Southern Africa countries and having a workshop talking about expanding renewable energy and energy access and what's the role of development finance institutions in this crucial task. And it really struck me that in many of these countries, especially the lower income countries, the government support for renewable energy has been slow. And even if there is still a large gap for energy access and that can be solved by renewable energy, I still feel either the government or the banks are not having enough capacity either in terms of technical or capital to support this. And I wonder, one of the things that we talked about is to finance the distributed renewable energy through financial institutions locally. But there has been also a lot of controversy, even though the World Bank, IFC, and AIIB, these institutions already have standards that say even if projects are financed through financial institutions, they still have to follow the safeguards of the multilateral higher standards. But still, I see some concerns and some failed cases in financing through financial institutions. So I wonder, what's your take on this approach of probably financing more distributed energy for renewables in such countries where needed, and how to guarantee the safeguards environmentally and socially?
Thank you. Should I?
Yep, yeah, the last word.
Chinese growth slowed down to 6%. I think there are various reasons. One of the reasons is not related to the trade disputes or anything else. I think after 4 decades of the faster growth, the economic base of China is huge. 1% growth today is not the same thing as the percentage growth 20, 30, 40 years ago. Slowing down is quite natural as the Chinese economy matures. Certainly, trade dispute with the United States has something to do with it, and also restructuring of the Chinese economy is another factor. For instance, if you look at China, along the coastal areas, we have basically done most of the infrastructure, you see, and as you see, the infrastructures are new and with state-of-the-art technologies. It's already in a very good condition, and continue to pump money into the fixed assets doesn't make a lot of sense. So 6%, in my view, is pretty positive. And also, the Chinese economy really needs to be restructured. Okay. Now, there's some debate about domestic consumption. The economists in China, I don't know much about it outside, do not really have the same they don't have the consensus about this. They say, you depend on consumption. Do you think the economy can really depend on consumption? And what kind of consumption? And do you still need to invest? If not in the traditional infrastructure, this kind of fixed assets investment, there might be something else to do. So there are some practical issues why the 6% growth is there. So I'm not that pessimistic. I think if China can achieve very solid growth, 5 or 6 for many years to come, it will be good enough. What's bad is the roller coasting kind of a growth, because you have a fast growth. Definitely, in the fast growth, there will be a lot of issues you have to deal with, right? Solid growth, in my view, is important for China. But then opening up the Chinese economy, particularly in the financial sector, and roll back the entry barriers for private sector companies would also help keeping the Chinese economy going forward. But so my prediction is that in in the Chinese economy over the next 1 or 2 or 3 decades. If China can achieve 5 or 6 around that, I think it will be very good. But it's not very good. I don't think it's advisable for you to achieve 8% of the growth. Then you take 3% to deal with the, environmental mess or something like that. Doesn't make anything. Doesn't make any sense. With regard to the one-player, two-player kind of things, you see, we remain in the family of multilateral development banks. We co-finance with the World Bank, EBRD, AIIB in those countries. Even if we do not co-finance, we have meetings together to know how we can improve the efficiency of the investments we make. I'm actually flying back after this meeting to attend the heads of MDB meeting this evening. So it's not a one-man band. It's not a one-man band. It's not one player. But of course, you still need to do things on your own, individually. I think individual responsibility is important for the collective responsibility. Right? Without individual responsibilities, there's no such thing as collective responsibility. So I think this is what we intend to do in close collaboration with all the other MDBs, but we need to do our job on our own properly. With regard to your question, I don't think MDBs themselves can change the world. We need to mobilize resources from private sector, and in most of cases, the private sector investors work on their own. Now, we also would provide financing to the commercial banks or other financial institutions for them to do the infrastructure projects. It's more cost effective. The only issue is they have to take care. They follow our standards. We do this. We finance, we provide loans to commercial banks in Turkey, for instance, and these banks would on-lend to the infrastructure projects. We also buy bonds of the institutional investors. We have this ESG-related portfolio. You know why? Because they can deal with smaller projects. We do big ones. We also put money in the private equity funds. It's all agreed. They should follow our standards. But of course, it's inevitable. Some investors may not come up to the standards we require. If that is the case, what we need to do is to tell them to address those issues. If they improve, if they correct, that's fine. And if they make no progress, then we are not going to work with them anymore. So we should understand. I think we should be humble enough to understand. MDBs can contribute or do so little. What we can achieve is actually a catalytic role. Now, this is the point I discussed with people on some other forum. I said, you see, in 1980, when China became a member of the World Bank and IMF, Chinese per capita GDP 280 per capita GDP, US dollars. 4 decades later, China is a contributor to AIIB concessional funding. China is one of the biggest contributors. China managed to lift 800 people out of poverty by China standard, 600 million people out of poverty by the World Bank standard. Okay. Now, take a look at the World Bank's funding to China. How much? I would say less than 50 billion US dollars. You multiply this $50 billion 10 times, it's still a drop in the bucket. You cannot expect World Bank to help China to lift 800 million people out of poverty. Does that detract from the World Bank's contribution? No. It's very positive. Because of the engagement with the World Bank, China learned a lot. So the World Bank's financing plays such a catalytic role. We have new approaches to financing fixed assets investment, international competitive bidding, environmental protection, training the people. So this is the seed money, I would say, the seed money. But mostly because of the World Bank's teaching, coaching, and working with the Chinese companies, we grow on our own. We manage to train our own people, and we follow all these standards. That is the catalytic role of the World Bank's financing. Likewise, when we do it today, we do not think AIIB's money can help some low-income countries out of poverty. It's impossible. We should be humble enough to know this. What we need to do is to work with the countries to improve their capacity and allow them to make some mistakes early in the stage. So that is the very important role. If you want to understand what catalytic role means, just look at the World Bank's involvement in China and what China has achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go out and have a reception where we can carry this conversation out into the hallways, I really want to thank Sarah Luttrell from our staff. As one person said, most of us were in Africa all week long, and she put this great event and got all of you to come here while we were all gone. So I really want to thank Sarah. I want to tell you about some other projects that we have going on at the center on Tuesday at 12:30. We're at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We'll be releasing this year's Trade and Development Report. That's at 12:30 at the center. I'd love to have you come by for that. And before we thank President Liqun, since it's getting to be autumn there, we wanted to give him something from his alma mater. We have a photograph. We have a jacket for him. Hope it fits. Well, we hope it's not another 30-plus years until President Jin comes back to Boston University. It's been great to have you back, and this place is always welcome to you.
This warm clothes an invitation to visit Boston University.
There we go.